September 17th, 1987. We were told it was a routine structural assessment. That word, routine, is the first lie I would learn to distrust. My name is Sergeant Ethan Ramirez. I spent a decade in uniform by the time I walked down that elevator and into a place I still refuse to call by any name the Army ever used in its memos. What I will tell you now is what I saw with my own eyes. U.S. soldiers found a sealed, non-human complex under New Mexico. I carry it like an injury that never healed. We left Kirtland before dawn. The desert was a flat, indifferent thing under a thinning moon, the black plain broken only by the glare of our convoy lights and the occasional silhouette of a mesa. David Ortega drove. He didn't say much on long hauls, swallowed by the wheel and the road like he believed silence was a better shield than prayer. Private Miguel Torres wrote radio and supply, fumbling with his headset like a kid with a new toy, counting out tape and batteries with the nervous rhythm of someone trying to create order out of uncertainty. Sergeant Javier Luna kept us tight, eyes sharp, voice low. Rodriguez was part of our security team. His laugh came only when it felt safe. Colonel Marcus Hayes met us on the tarmac at a strip not listed on any public flight plan. His posture suggested he had spent a lifetime telling other men to look straight ahead and do what they were told. When Hayes speaks, people move. We were briefed inside a room that smelled like too strong coffee and government linen. Hayes stood at the head, a man used to the authority his collar carried. He gave us the basic layout, a 5-level subterranean complex under a facility near Dulce, accessible through a reinforced elevator. Structural anomalies found during a routine check required hands-on verification. "We need eyes on the lower structure," he said. "Limited footprint, environmental assessment only, no interaction with research." Those were the constraints, and like most constraints in sites like that, they were suggestions dressed as rules. Dr. Samuel Moreno was there with Dr. Alan Cortez. Moreno carried himself like a man who'd spent too many nights with fluorescent lights for company. Cortez was clinical, precise, the sort of scientist who wears his skepticism like a badge. They were the faces that made the place feel less like a military operation and more like a lab escort. Moreno told us to stick to the marked paths, to keep contamination protocols in mind, to not touch anything that wasn't on the inventory list. His hands trembled just slightly when he adjusted his glasses. I noticed it, and I remember thinking then it was nerves, not fear. There were lines on his face that read like warnings. We were issued the usual, hard helmets, rucks, flashlights with tacky beams, gas masks we hoped we'd never live to our faces. The elevator itself was an old industrial box with a keypad and 5 sealed buttons. On the schematic Hayes unrolled, the bottommost button was labeled Level 5 and marked with a solid, stamped warning. A red rectangle sat over it on the paper, and official "Do Not Enter" in all but name. "We're going to check structural integrity to Level 4, Hayes told us. "Verify seals, get readings, get out." The colonel's mouth made the line that said, "Do not argue." That would be the first time I watched an order bend without breaking. We descended. The elevator hummed like a living thing. No small motor whine, but an almost muscle-deep vibration, a sound that sat in the bones. Levels passed by on the panel like heartbeats. Level 2, Level 3, Level 4. The air changed as we went down. Thinner, colder, less forgiving. The light in the elevator was a bulb with the color of old teeth. When the door opened onto Level 2, we were beneath the desert, and daylight was a rumor. Level 2 looked like any research facility you can imagine, but stripped of anything welcoming. Drab tile, steel doors with portholes, conduit running along ceilings like veins. The ventilation sang a low, constant note that everyone pretends not to hear until it's the only thing left. Environmental monitors hummed and blinked. Green, green, green. At first, everything was routine, the sort of routine that meant cataloging beams and checking concrete integrity. We walked through storage rooms built into the rock. There were shelving units with labeled boxes and plastic crates stamped with inventory codes. It could have been geology or telescope parts. It could have been anything. The place told a story of utility, not spectacle. But the first oddity arrived wrapped in ordinary things. In a maintenance closet, tucked behind boxes of replacement filters, I found pages of schematics that didn't match the maps Hayes had shown us. They were older, hand-annotated, and the ink had bled slightly where someone had breathed on it too long. The corridor they hinted at didn't show on the official prints. I told Luna. He shrugged and told me to keep moving. That shrug bit at me, a man who'd learned to keep his head down in the face of awkward truth. At Level 3, the monitors flicked more warning lights. Not alarm, but that soft incline from green to yellow I now know as a presentiment. The humidity meters read slightly higher. There was a faint chemical tang to the air, metallic like pennies, but sweeter, like old pennies left in a jar. We passed a refrigerated archive,
an alcove with a heavy glass door and humidity controls humming at its lip. Inside were shelves and shelves of small labeled vials, each in foam cradles. When Dr. Moreno opened the freezer, a tiny blizzard of cold fog curled out and laid itself along the floor. The vials were clear and varied in color. Some were amber, others slightly green. They were cataloged, precise, clinical, and the labels contained codes we didn't recognize.
Moreno put a hand on the glass as if feeling a pulse from the other side, and then told us not to photograph anything. He keyed a terminal, and the feed came up on a monitor. Inventory numbers, dates. The dates made my skin tighten. They were older than anything Hayes had let on. I remember a moment in that cold room where the light from our flashlights carved white paths across the vials. Miguel whispered behind me, "Do you think it's animals?" And I didn't have an answer. My training told me to log, to secure the perimeter, to file. My humanity asked broader questions the uniform wasn't meant for. Those two things pulled at each other like opposing tides. Level 4 contained observation cells. Observation windows like aquarium glass looked out into reinforced chambers. Behind one pane was a narrow corridor, and then reinforced glass the color of river ice. The cells were empty when we first looked through them, but the recordings on the monitors were the oddest part. Time-lapse images, slow captures of shapes moving in patterns that didn't fit any animal we knew. Some of the movement was deliberate, like a being crossing a room on two limbs, while other footage displayed motion that was layered, like an organism compressing and unfolding into new positions within seconds. Dr. Cortez watched the monitors quietly, his mouth a straight line. "Behavioral conditioning," he muttered into his hand. I wanted to ask what conditioning for. He looked at me and said nothing. It was on level 4 that I found the unmapped passage for certain. We were running a sweep at my insistence. A maintenance hatch in a storage alcove had been worn at an edge. Not fresh, not old, but smoothed by hands. It wasn't on the official map Hayes had given us. When I pressed my gloved palm to the metal, I felt a vibration, a faint rhythm that wasn't mine. I got a look from Luna that suggested discretion. He moved the hatch aside with the smallest of motions, like he was avoiding breaking a glass animal. Behind it was a narrow tunnel, the sort that wants to be forgotten. It smelled richer than the rest of the facility, a mixture of ozone and something faintly organic. I shouldn't have opened it, and that thought hit me with the same clarity as the flashlight cutting into dust. But curiosity has weight. We had standing orders to observe, not interact. Still, launch codes and secrecy get easier to obey when they apply to someone else. I inched a light down, and the beam revealed cabled walls and small nodes that pulsed with a faint bioluminescent sheen. The tunnel sloped gently downward. There were footprints in the dust that didn't match any boot pattern I knew, longer, narrower, with impressions that hinted at more than 2 weight-bearing points. The sight felt like a violation. I called Moreno over. He frowned into the tunnel, then into the monitor. He said nothing for a long breath. "This shouldn't be here," he said finally, which is a strange thing for a scientist to say. Scientists usually know where things should be. The fact that he used the language of wonder and loss in equal measure tempered whatever reaction I might have expected from a militarized man. We found schematics tucked into a cabinet near the tunnel. They were older than the maps Hayes distributed, marked in a handwriting that leaned toward desperation. The layout indicated additional sublevels branching from where our official drawings ended. Someone had scrawled Level 5, Restricted, across the folded paper. There was a stamped seal we couldn't read, and an annotation beside it, Sealed, Do Not Breach. That red stamp sat like a bruise on the page. I tucked the schematics into my jacket without thinking, and felt the weight of them like a loose bullet. Everything we were shown after that felt choreographed to avoid the obvious. Dr. Moreno and Dr. Cortez shepherded us through corridors with the practiced ease of people who have learned how to tell half-truths politely. When we asked direct questions, they provided answers that were precise and evasive, like polished knives. Hayes watched the team with a posture that suggested he was measuring who might be a problem later. He told us the seals were intact, that environmental levels were within acceptable thresholds, and that any deviation would be logged and corrected. The monitors hummed in the background like a chorus of small machines trying to stay sane. There were other hints. A badge reader refused our access at one corridor. It flicked red and then yielded when Moreno keyed his bypass. An airlock would depressurize and then come back, the panel reading Manual Override Engaged. There was choreography in every denial.
When you work below the ground in a place built for secrecy, the architecture itself begins to hold stories you are not supposed to read. On level 4, the observation panes showed more than empty cells. In one, behind a window that fogged faintly from breath we assumed came from another world, something moved with a gravity we didn't have the words for. It wasn't human, but it wasn't a mere animal either. I imagine other listeners want me to put a label on it. Alien, extraterrestrial, unknown species. I didn't yet have the right language to say what my eyes tried to name. The subject had limbs that were too long in the forearm, hands that tapered into fingers that looked more like tendrils when extended, and a face set in a shape that threw light in unexpected ways. Its eyes were deep hollows, not blank, but like pits where light pooled and refused to be interrogated. The specimen's skin had a sheen like oil on water, and it moved with a dignity that felt like intelligence. We called it Subject 3 because names had not been deemed suitable. The military loves numbers. Numbers are easy to inventory. Subject 3 was awake in some of the fly-through footage, pacing in a pattern you might call ritual.
Cortez explained behaviors with language that came from textbooks: stimulus-response, conditioned motions, circadian cues. He spoke to the monitor like a man explaining the world to a child. I watched his shoulders knot and unknit, and I reminded myself that scientists are people too. Sometimes people do the softest things when they think no one watches, like pressing a fingertip to glass. Then there were the tanks on level 5. I should say that the first time anyone used the word tank in earnest, I realized how small our vocabulary was for the things that held life and then possibly took it away. The tank doors were cylindrical and lined like the inside of a drum. They were stainless, thick, and sealed with clamps that had the kind of industrial precision you can trust until you can't. Each was numbered. Tank 7 was one of them. Tank 7 would be the one that changed everything. We were not supposed to be on level 5. Hayes had been explicit about that. But plans and contingencies are different organisms. When Moreno pulled keys from an inner pocket and whispered, "For inspection only," we were already navigating the corridor toward the sealed door. The control room at the entrance to level 5 looked like a bank of watching things. Monitors stacked like a city skyline, consoles with switches, and a large overhead schematic glowing green. There was a red light beside a bank labeled Containment, and a diagram showing rows of cylindrical cells. Someone had drawn a thick black line around a section of them, and then crosshatched the same space, the mark of a place that is both important and dangerous to name. Hayes paced the control room like a man counting the seconds until an explosion. He barked orders in that voice that trims off the edges of queries. "You see anything outside of allowable parameters, you tell me," he said. He said it the way men say it when they hope someone else will be the one to have to make a hard call. We peered into the first tank through a round viewport. The glass was thick and treacherous, coated inside with condensation that dragged down like a veil. A light inside the tank picked out shapes, and the silhouette of something very wrong slotted into the beam like a dark comrade. It bobbed in the solution like a creature in slow motion, limbs folded in on themselves with an economy of motion that was almost elegant. This object, being, whatever the proper term, was not quite the humanoid I had seen peering out from observation cells. The proportions were off, the head too broad, the neck long and gossamer, the digits splayed in a way that suggested both adaptation and missing kin. It had depthless eyes, as if light fell into them and didn't come back. Dr. Moreno watched it with a kind of reverent horror. "They're alive," he said, which is a small sentence that carries very large weights. He didn't say alien. He didn't have to. The word would have been too tidy. He said what was undeniable. They're alive.
There was a board stamped with notations of health and consciousness. The monitors tracked vitals, pulses, thermal differentials, humidity within the tanks. Some readouts had neat green checks, others flickered amber. The console near Tank 7 had a manual indicator, seal integrity, nominal. But the digital readout glitched when I looked at it, a hiccup like a throat clearing. Moreno frowned, tapping keys, and then said, "There's a microfracture I don't like. We should do a full maintenance window." Maintenance window was a phrase meant to soothe. It wouldn't soothe me. Some of the tanks contained subjects curled like sleeping things. Others were open to scrutiny like specimens in jars. One of them, down the row from Tank 7, held a tall, angular figure whose profile was like a bad memory. Its limbs were too long, and when it turned its head, it did something to the light around it. That tall specimen had a presence that made you aware of the body you were in. For a moment, it lifted a hand, and through the glass its fingers traced the curve of condensation. It looked deliberate. It looked like someone who knew they were being watched. I didn't know what to do with that look. It felt like recognition. It felt like accusation. There was a slip of paper by the control console with notes in an older hand. Observation. Intelligence. Subject 7 shows delayed response to stimuli. Subject 3 shows patterned movements consistent with internal signaling. These words were clinical enough to pass on paper, but hearing them in the room felt small and thin. Intelligence isn't something you chalk in a notebook. It arrives and then expands and asks how you intend to treat it. My radio crackled. Miguel's voice over the feed was tinny. "Everything nominal on our end, Sergeant." He didn't sound nominal. His fingers were probably buzzed with the kind of adrenaline you get from doing something you know you shouldn't. Luna kept glancing at me like he was deciding whether to nod or to slap me for being more curious than cautious. Rodriguez moved to the door, hand on his weapon the way a man keeps a rosary in the inside pocket, private and sacred. Hayes directed Moreno to take samples from Tank 7's external sensor array. "Extract is non-invasive," Hayes said, which is a phrase meant to comfort men who think only in procedure. Moreno hesitated for the smallest of beats, and then moved with a deliberate, careful method. He attached leads and probes, and a soft hiss of vacuum began around the clamps. The tank's internal lighting shifted from a soft indigo to a warmer amber, as if the being inside was reacting to the intrusion like any animal might. I saw its eyes narrow. Whether it was threat assessment or merely a reflex, I couldn't say. But the change in the creature's posture was as noticeable as a soldier drawing breath to shout. Cortez set his hand on the console the way a pilot touches a stable stick in turbulent air.
There was a pressure in the room, like a held breath. The monitors began to measure micro-fluctuations in the water's conductivity. The readouts bled into color, and a small LED beside Tank 7 flicked from green to yellow. Moreno's fingers moved over the keys faster now, running diagnostics, trying to parse something his training didn't fully prepare him to name. He said, "There's a small breach in the tank matrix. We can fix it, but it will require transfer to a mobile containment unit." Transfer. The word made the room shrink. Hayes looked at me as if to weigh whether sending security into a biological environment was something to be trusted to a sergeant with one eye and a conscience. He made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. "Prepare for transfer. Luna, Ramirez, with me. Ortega, watch the entry hall." His voice folded responsibility into the syllables, and I felt the weight of it like a pack on my shoulders. We moved like trained beasts, precise, rehearsed. Suits zipped, seals checked, the ritual performed in low, sharp breaths. Mask on, gloves double-rolled, airlock sealed. The mobile containment unit was a slab of stainless and plastic, a coffin painted in the practical gray of institutional defense. They rolled it into place with hydraulic hiss and needy hands. Moreno's eyes found mine for a second. He didn't say anything. He shook his head in a way that was wearied more by knowledge than by fear. "Keep clear of the glass," he said, voice low. "Containment protocols dictate non-visual proximity when transferring." He was quoting policy and hiding his own fear behind it. I understood. Glass makes watchers think a closer kin than they are. Glass lets you pretend you know another creature by lighting and silhouette. It is a lie of intimacy. We prepped the interface. The transfer apparatus docked to the tank with a sound like a mouth closing. There was a pressurization routine, and then a slow exchange. Fluid displacement, sensors calibrating, valves flexing. The first phase went smoothly, and a collective exhale moved through the room like a wind. But the monitors had begun to tell a different story. Small ripples in conductivity marched across the console like insects. An indicator labeled a matrix integrity started to jump. "Hold," Cortez said. He didn't yell. The words hung like glass. He tried to slow it with hands that tried to be measured and clinical, and then the backup systems clicked their little metal tongues into place. But redundancy, even the best planned, relies on the idea of margin. Here, margin thinned. I remember the sound that followed like a broken cord. A small, sterile popping noise came from Tank 7, like a bubble rising and bursting at the surface of a still pond. The readout jerked into alarm. A thin filament of microcrack spread across the viewport like a spider's hair. Moreno cursed under his breath in a language I have heard only once since that. The creature inside the tank shifted quickly and with purpose, its appendages splaying outward like someone waking from a sleep that felt like a sentence. "Seal it!" Hayes snapped. His voice was the only thing that cut cleanly through the rising chaos. We worked faster, hands moving by reflex, commands shouted in the clipped language that comes when men are urgently trying to keep something contained. The transfer should have been a controlled ballet. It became a scramble. The mobile containment unit's hatch jammed briefly, as if the mechanism itself protested.
Moreno's fingers found the manual override, and the lights flickered on the panel. A red lamp burned steadily on the console now, and the alert tone was no longer a small beep, but a hungry, increasing whine that set my teeth on edge. At that very instant, something happened with a kind of undeniable, awful clarity. The specimen's head snapped toward the viewport, and its eyes, those pits that swallowed light, seemed to find mine. For a fraction of a second, between the hiss of systems and the chorus of alarms, I felt as if whatever intelligence sat in that tank knew more about me than I knew about it. It looked at me the way a man looks at another man he's known for years. It did not blink. Then the first fissure opened, like a bad sentence, and fluid leaked in a long, slow line down the inside of the glass. We don't have to finish what came next yet, but I'll tell you this. What happened at that threshold, the moment when a piece of glass gave under pressure and the world rearranged itself around that failure, changed the narrative of what we were doing from inspection to contingency, from inspection to crisis. People who had been telling themselves that this mission was a simple structural check found that phrase evaporating in the warmth of an expanding problem. Orders began to multiply. Airlocks slammed. Someone shouted a latitude and a countdown. Moreno's face went the color of a man who had seen his life's work walk up to the line and then leap. I felt the sap in my hands, the smell of ozone, and something else, something living, warm, and liberating, fill the room like wind through a cracked window. In the big picture of a soldier's life, you imagine being in battles in open fields or alleys where you can at least see the shape of danger in the distance. This was different. This was containment gone private and intimate, an intimacy between human protocol and whatever had been put on the other side of clear glass. It was a meeting that our maps and our manuals had never prepared for. We had been told to verify the seals and then to leave. We had been told certain areas were off limits. Those lines, once meant to protect people or objects or secrets, began to blur. I could feel the moment of rupture like an animal's pulse. It told me, in the wet language of emergency, that what we faced wasn't just a technical failure.
It was a moral fork, to continue watching or to step in where our orders told us not to go. Hayes was already shouting into his radio, calling code words I don't repeat because they have no power in daylight. Rodriguez and Luna moved to secure the corridor. Miguel's radio squawked with a voice that had become high with adrenaline. I remember my own hands, steadying the transfer line, slamming a clamp closed, seeing the beads of fluid that didn't belong to any ledger form on the tank's exterior, like a small, precise verdict. Someone said the word breach into the static, and it hung hot in the air like a burning coal. A breach in any environment is a problem. A breach in a place built to hold things that might be smarter than you is a failure with moral edges you can't easily sand down. The console again, the readouts, the alarms. The tall, angular specimen down the row remained still as a sentinel, its head cocked as if listening to a song only it could hear. The tall one turned its long neck and traced a line on its side with a limb. It was a small, human-like movement that resounded with meaning only because the room felt like being inside the belly of a beast. I had no grand theological explanation. I had a body that responded the way bodies respond to imminent danger, the blood pumping faster, the mind narrowing to task. And in that narrowing, I remember one thought clear as a bell. If this place had been hiding living, non-human beings in tanks for years, what was the justification? And even if justification existed on some higher chart, what right did that give men to treat living intelligence like inventory? The question was private and raw in a place of screaming alarms. They told us later that the plan was to secure, then evacuate, then neutralize if necessary. They used words like neutralize because it is easier to keep conscience at a distance with clinical language. But in the room, words had little use. We were men and machines and blinking lights. We were trying to keep a lid on a pressure cooker whose steam smelled of unknown things. We had orders. We had a chain of command. For the first time in my career, those commands came laced with a sense of far-reaching consequences that slapped at the edges of my training. To follow orders here might mean destroying something that could be called intelligent. Refusing orders meant insubordination, possibly court-martial, possibly worse. Moreno's hand trembled on the console as he keyed an emergency protocol.
Hayes looked at us like a man deciding who to trust with his life and the lives in his custody. Outside the control room, the facility's systems did what they'd been built to do. Alarms echoed through corridors like a chorus of small, enraged animals. Red lights painted the walls. The ventilation shifted to negative pressure as if the building were taking a defensive breath. The air itself tasted like ionized metal and the faint sweetness of biological fluid.
It felt wrong to call it sweet, but let me tell you, when you finally have the lexicon to name what you're experiencing, it will not always fit tidy categories. We were there to assess infrastructure. We walked into a moral and practical dilemma instead. The complexity of it was like a knot you could not cut cleanly. It gripped us. Men who had sworn to protect a nation suddenly asked to protect a secret at all costs. The room blurred into a sequence of clipped movements. Moreno trying to stabilize the tank, Cortez monitoring vitals, Hayes calling out options, Luna and Rodriguez checking doors, Miguel shoring up entries. My hands moved in practice gestures, closing valves, slamming emergency overrides, watching the meter jump. Then the first transfer attempt stalled. What came next was a blend of human improvisation and mechanized response. Men in suits worked like technicians and like priests, mixing ritual with procedure. We had forms for everything in our lives, forms to report, forms to catalog, forms to sign off that something was done. None of those forms fit what we were attempting to hold together in the span of a single minute. And here, we will pause, on the threshold of what became the moment every one of us would replay until it stopped replaying, which it sometimes does not. The alarms were building into a rhythm that demanded action. Fingers hovered over buttons bearing names I had learned to respect: containment lockdown, emergency seal, manual dump. The tank's pressure was fluctuating. The mobile containment unit's clamps had not fully engaged. The glass had a hairline crack that looked like a new river in a dry place. I remember thinking then, with a clarity that felt like a shout, that the thing behind that glass knew it was alive, and knew, in some sense, who had put it there. The longer I look back, the more that thought expands into a terrible atlas of responsibility. We were custodians of a secret that friction would not let us keep safe. We believed we were doing what the country ordered of us, but in that room, with the hiss of a failing tank and the bright red panic of indicators, it felt like a moral ledger had been opened, and the numbers were heavy. The transfer attempt was about to resume. Moreno moved to reroute the pressure, Hayes barked a final instruction, and our bodies tightened for a motion none of us knew would end cleanly. The red indicator pulsed. Tank 7's internal light grew from amber to a worrying orange. The creature inside the tank, Subject 3, ceased to be a thing in observation and became a presence. It looked at me again. I looked back. Time folded. We are here. We are here together at the place where the official story and the private truth begin to disagree.
And as we leaned into that moment, someone, somewhere, above, below, in a room with a chain of command too long and too entangled to name in a breath, made a decision that would ripple outward like a shockwave, and that would bind our lives to secrecy and to a weight nobody should have to carry alone. They decided to secure, then evacuate, then neutralize if necessary. Those three verbs sat in the air like ordnance labels: careful, clinical, each one promising a different kind of finality. The words came down from places I could not see. The unnamed general's voice, static relayed from an office above. Orders parsed through Hayes with that habit he had of turning commands into a rhythm the rest of us would have to match. He looked at us and said, "We don't let this go public. Evacuate non-essential personnel. Contain casualties. Prepare for demolition as a contingency." Demolition? I remember my mouth tasting of dust and something else, like copper and fear. Demolition is a word you use when nothing else will do. Demolition is the kind of answer that makes questions stop in their tracks. We moved under the sort of mechanical calm that only comes when you have to do something terrible on a timetable. Men in has-suits hauled panels and sealed doors. Tex handed Moreno extra clamps that glinted in the amber light. Cortez barked a sequence of checks into a recorder as if reciting, into posterity or into some invisible ledger, what we were doing. I caught Rodriguez's eye across a corridor. His jaw had that tight draw soldiers wear when they swallow a verdict. Luna's shoulders were coiled like wire. Miguel's hands trembled when he passed me a set of extra clips. We all did what we were trained to do. We became the instrument of procedure. Tank 7's crack widened under pressure. That small fissure became a kind of language. At first it spoke in a whisper, a fine hairline that curved like a river. Then it spoke louder, and with the sound of vacuum pumps and failing seals,
it became a shout. The water, whatever solution they kept those bodies in, began a slow, deliberate weeping down the inner curve of the viewport. Moreno cursed. Cortez's face folded into something I had seen in medics on bad nights, a man who knew the difference between calculation and mourning. "Get it into the mobile unit now," Hayes ordered. The words were clipped. They invited no argument. We booted the transfer sequence again. It was a choreography grown through paperwork and rehearsal. Mating flanges, pressurization with counterflow, incremental sealing, 1,000 millimeters of tolerance. I felt the rhythm of those steps like the tick of a metronome in my bones. For a handful of seconds, it looked like we might pull the transfer off. Then the matrix integrity readouts hiccuped. Not random, not mechanical, but like a pulse going out of time. The tank's internal light stuttered. Something on the inside changed its position as if sensing a moment and deciding to act upon it.
It flexed like a sleeper rolling in a dream, slow at first, and then with a tension that made the suspension lines shudder. There was a sound like glass giving way without breaking, not the explosive shattering you hear in movies, but a long, cruel sound of tension released. The viewport spiderwebbed along the hairline, a pattern that crawled and then split. The liquid inside the tank squeezed outward like a living scar, and with it came a spray of small, oily droplets that smelled faintly of metal and seaweed. The atmosphere of the control room turned viscous. The ventilation responded with more force but could not win against the smell. I remember the way the light punctured the edge of the hairline and then broke, and the inside of the tank revealed itself in a rush. The specimen's limbs unfurled like a creature being born into speed. It did not scream. It did not behave like we expected. It pushed and flexed against the failing glass with a purpose that read as intention. Then it breached. It wasn't a cinematic tumble into our room, more of a slide and then a glide, as if the thing had practiced its escape inside the slow arc of fluid and had only needed a fraction of a second to translate that motion into something muscular. The transfer interface spit and coughed. The mobile unit's hatch jammed. A bead of fluid arced across the floor like spilled mercury and left a thin trace that darkened the light underfoot. We shot at containment measures first. Valves slammed, chemical neutralizers clicked, things that read on paper as capable of slowing spread. But those were measures designed for spills, for organic contamination, not for moving, thinking bodies. The thing that had been in Tank 7 collapsed to the floor of the control bay with a wet, patient sound, not thrashing, but like someone folding after a journey. It moved with limbs that somehow betrayed both dexterity and an economy of motion I recognized as intelligence. It rose and tested the air with a motion that could easily have been called smelling. It turned its head toward us, and in that fraction of time it raised a limb as if to indicate something, an index finger extended, oddly human in proportion, perhaps pointing at the console, or perhaps at me. The movement felt like indictment. "Fire!" came a voice. Hayes, I think. Someone fired. Bullets pinged from protected steel into empty air or into panels. I had my own weapon out, but I remember seeing the recoil of bodies when the first bursts went off, and the sound of gunfire ricocheting off stainless surfaces like a percussion track that belonged in the wrong place. Shots were fired to halt movement, not to kill, but in that light you cannot keep intention tidy. The specimen reacted with movement that was simultaneously fast and too graceful to trust. It ducked and slipped into the dark of a service corridor like a shadow rolling into itself. The alarms intensified. Doors around us closed under hammer pressure.
Red strobes painted the faces of men who had sworn oaths that now felt inadequate. A secondary alarm brayed. Containment failure, Section C. That voice had the shallow moderation of machines making life and death announcements without compassion. The building went into a defensive sequence I had only seen in drills. Gas seals hissed, airflows reversed, stairwells locked. Yet through each defense, a small logic of failure threaded itself. Each redundancy had been conceived against probability, and probability had been disrespected. The first breach was the harbinger. Then another tank keyed out its own protest, and another hairline opened like a mouth. Alarms multiplied in a way that made them almost useless. The monitors tumbled from colored checks to frantic blinking warnings. The environmental logs showed contamination pockets traveling through the facility like cold fronts. We realized with a growing knot of dread
that containment failure was not the failure of a single vessel, but the failing of a system. In the corridor outside the control room, the lights stuttered. Figures moved, human silhouettes and other shapes making for exits, making for hiding. I saw one of the taller specimens slip past a bank of reinforcement doors, its elbows tucked, its hands flexing like a swimmer feeling water. It moved with an economy that suggested both adaptation and purpose. I watched Luna and Rodriguez shift into security posture, guns raised, low voices barking orders. Miguel's headset screeched with fragmented comms. Somewhere deeper, in rooms we had not been allowed to enter, alarms must have been having different kinds of conversations. When the tall specimen turned and fixed its long, pale face toward me, I felt as if something in that look named me. I cannot say whether it meant harm or merely recognition. It lifted a hand, and in motion so deliberate my own body slowed in reaction, pointed directly at where I stood. The gesture landed like a verdict. For a moment the room held its breath as if hoping the thing would also choose to speak in a grammar we knew. It did not. But its fingers, those long, tapered digits, opened like invitation or indictment, and I felt naked in a way the uniform had never permitted me to be. Shots rang uncontrolled down the corridors. Some of the specimens made no sound as they moved. Others made small vocalizations that were almost musical, notes and clicks, and a cadence that refused to be translated into human screams or roars. They were not monsters like those in books. They were beings moving through the world, bodies out of place and out of mercy. We were men in suits trained for threats and taught to meet them with force. Then the contamination alarms turned into structural warnings. A secondary power relay overloaded. A cooling manifold failed in a lab I had only glimpsed through reflection. Our plans frayed.
Hayes called in our code words to command, and the voice on the other end, a clipped officer who would be, we were told later, the general's liaison, said only what we were already guessing. Prepare for controlled detonation. No personnel within danger radius. Take heads out for evac. You have authority to evacuate now. Detonation. Saying the word another time made it sound smaller, like part of a checklist. But in the rooms where men sweat and fight, it meant something larger. Finality. The erasure of a place and perhaps of lives. A decision to remove evidence by force. Morally, it sat between us like a loaded artifact. I thought of Moreno and his white-knuckled hands on the console. I thought of the specimens, still in their rooms, still blinking light into glass. I thought of the tall one pointing at me, the slow, accusing motion. Hayes turned to me. We're getting people out. Help me with the last sweep. His face had that soldier's blankness, the kind that lulls you into following. We scraped the facility clean. There were scenes that now live in my head like a collage I cannot tidy. A corridor with overturned carts and slick trails of unknown fluid. A lab with paperwork half gnawed at by panic. An observation window fogged with breath and handprints. We found other living subjects attempting to navigate their way through ducts and vents. Bodies long and awkward. Bodies that moved in ways that mocked our vocabulary. Security teams set up lines of fire. Med-techs administered sedative darts when they could. Some specimens were retrieved to the extent we could retrieve them, dragged into mobile units or corralled into temporary cells. In some places there was no chance at capture. In others, men with histories and hearts did the ugly math and decided to shoot to stop what could not be stopped. We lost personnel. I will not describe their wounds because that is not what I have the right to decide. What I can say is this. There were friends who did not get home that night. There were comradely anchors ripped from whatever small universes we had carved inside uniform. The charge sheet in my mind has pages I never allowed to be read. What happened in those corridors changed men in ways I have seen on the surface of faces for years. There was a moment when the unnamed general's liaison arrived in person, and the room that had briefly been a command center became a tribunal. Men with rank and men's faces made decisions with the clipped coldness of officer men who work with probability tables. We were told the perimeter must be secured, that no more personnel could be risked, that demolition was the only reliable way to ensure nothing of value, of threat, could escape into the light uncontrolled. Nothing of this scope can be allowed into the public domain, he told us. We cannot risk contamination, exposure, escalation. Hayes argued. He said, we have living specimens here. We can study them.
He said it with a scientist's hunger and a soldier's calculation. The liaison shrugged like a man who had made worse choices on behalf of a nation. Long-term custody is not feasible here, he said. Authorize demolition. That was the authorization we had feared and expected both. It was a decision that had the smell of an old bureaucratic certainty,
someone's back-of-the-envelope calculus that meant one auditorium of men would save many until no one needed to know the arithmetic. Orders came down to evacuate non-essential personnel immediately and withdraw security to staging. We were to set timers and stand by on the ridge 2 clicks out, awaiting the fire and brimstone. General protocols we had only seen in simulations were now black and white commands. NDA enforcement, the liaison murmured to Hayes, not as an insult but as a warning. People would be required to sign away speech as a condition of returning to private life. Men already hand-creased with secrecy looked blank at those words. We went out to the ridge. The desert spread like an indifferent sea beneath the wide gray sky. We watched through binoculars as blasts of orange and white ate the facility, first in small local detonations meant to wreck structural integrity, and then in charges meant to collapse key support points and seal underground passages. The earth answered with a thin, shocked moan, and then a great tearing that threw up dust and a mushroom of rock. From that distance, the facility went silent in a way buildings sometimes do when they are about to change their names from places to ruins. A column of dust rose, then collapsed in on itself like a giant exhalation. For a long time after the charges finished, the ground smoked, and the crater glowed a dull red in the night like an unblinking wound. We were told the official story within 24 hours, a geological collapse, an experimental facility that suffered infrastructural failure leading to explosion, no casualties, no sensitive material lost, and an ongoing investigation. They rehearsed it like a script. Seismic event, said the press release. Unfortunate instability, said the statement. No credible threat, said the public affairs liaison. The press swallowed the story, and the line between what had happened and what people could be told ground itself to dust. But the men who'd been there knew otherwise. I remember the shape of the crater as the dust settled, an open mouth in the earth, a bowl that swallowed sound. There were pieces of stainless and polymer strewn about like the residue of a mouth that had chewed and spit. We watched the crater being cordoned with heavy equipment. They dumped earth back into the hole as if simply dressing a wound would erase the living shapes once held inside. When the vehicles left, they left a circle of broken hope behind. Then came the paperwork.
The administrative chain is often how secrecy binds itself to lives, memos that are signed and pages that keep people quiet. We were all brought in for debriefs. Those debriefs were long and precise. We told what we had seen, and then were told what we could say. We were required to sign documents beneath lines that promised consequences if we broke silence. The words on those pages were legal and thick, made to bend memory into silence. We were offered reassignment or discharge, and the choice was not a real choice because the conditions were shackled. Speak and face prosecution. Be silent and return to a life half certain. I signed. Others signed. Men with heads full of the desert and the smell of tanks and the faces of the living we had seen signed, because the world told us signing was survival. Luna kept a face like a shutter in weather. Miguel could not sleep for days and then weeks, and his hands trembled when he tried to tighten screw caps. Rodriguez grew quieter. Hayes disappeared into paperwork and then into a higher place of command, where his voice had to sound more like orders and less like a man's throat. They dissolved our unit quietly. Our records were scrubbed of the more specific notations. We were reassigned, retired, or discharged. I requested discharge. By November of 1987, my time in uniform ended with a ceremony that felt flimsy after what we had been through. The papers read honorable, which reads well on forms. No one at my discharge ceremony asked me about the crater in the desert. No one mentioned the tanks. People with friendly faces shook my hand and said things about future plans, about taking off the uniform and doing something quiet. Maybe they knew as little as the public did. Maybe they assumed the world was better for not knowing. I went home. The house smelled the way houses smell when they have not been the scene of crisis. Drier warmth, coffee, a general domestic softness that made the memory of stainless and alarms feel like an intrusion. My wife, Carol, said nothing at first, because the parts of a person who come back from things like this are not always the ones that speak freely. I tried to tell her pieces of it and stopped often because there was a clause in my head that told me not to. It wasn't just signed paper, it was like a hand placed on my mouth. So I learned to say the truth in fragments. There were tanks. I saw a thing like a man, but wrong. We detonated the facility. Those statements landed in our kitchen like small, jagged stones. At night, the dreams began.
They are not as cinematic as you'd imagine. They come as textures, the smell of sealed glass, the sound of a pump clicking beneath metal, a hand pressed to a viewport, a long finger pointing. Sometimes I dream of the crater, a bowl in the earth, and the sound of wind moving across that hollow like a voice. I wake in sweating fragments, the bedclothes a tangle of restraining.
The dreams make me measure the space between history and what we call official truth. I tried to go back to a routine job. I worked things with my hands, because hands remember beyond language. But there was a weight that never took its leave. I found myself checking vents and monitors at home, with habits that made Carol laugh nervously. I could not stand certain films. Red emergency lights trigger an old muscle memory, so old I can feel my chest constrict the way it did when the control room went into lockdown. Loud mechanical hums make my teeth ache. Smells, metallic, faintly sweet, bring back the image of wet glass and the way the specimen looked when it found my eyes. We were given counseling, mandatory sessions scheduled by command. Men tried to talk and then reeled back because the words weren't allowed to be used. How do you talk about bearing witness to something the government calls non-existent? The counselors were kind, some of them. A few of them knew the lingo. I remember one old counselor, a woman with thinning hair and a grandfatherly compassion, who said something to me I have never forgotten. You can stand on the fact that you were where you were. It was a permission I had been withholding from myself. There were rumors in the months that followed, of other sites, of transfers, of shipments moved in the night. Some of those rumors were nothing but rumor. Others carried the noise of probable truth. I do not speak them because I do not want to be the wind that fans rumor into blaze. I will say only this. The sort of thing we found was not easily contained by one crater. In the years after the demolition, I learned how secrecy burrows through lives. People change jobs, move towns, adopt quiet habits. Some former teammates married and had kids. They smiled in photographs, and never, to my knowledge, spoke at public gatherings about that night. Miguel left the army early. His letters were short and wound with fear. Luna stayed on for a while, and then one day he was gone from the roster, as if a name had been excised. Hayes moved into higher avenues, where he could give orders that other men would follow. Moreno, Dr. Samuel Moreno, was reassigned to a research administration post. His name on one paper read Moreno, on another it read Moreno. Sometimes the records themselves possessed the same uneasy ambiguity that the rest of the world had about what occurred there. That small mismatch, Moreno, Moreno, seemed trivial until you realize how often bureaucracy becomes a place for erasures. I have spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to be a witness bound by agreement. The non-disclosure agreements we signed were not just legal shackles. They were also psychological lines drawn across minds. In normal life, you tell a story and someone replies, and you are validated or corrected. In our case, the reply was silence enforced by law.
That silence compresses memory into private shapes and converts what should be shared into private burdens. It is a kind of loneliness that eats gently at the edges of a person. People sometimes ask me why I am telling this now. The honest answer is that silence is not neutral. It is corrosive. There are things that, if left to calcify, do harm. The other reason is simpler and humbler. Carrying a memory without an audience is heavy. The world deserves witnesses, even when it does not deserve every truth. I am telling you because the words sometimes act as a mild exorcism. Saying aloud reduces terror to a manageable weight. Also, there is the practical concern that secrets erode trust between citizens and institutions. When a government says, "Trust us," with a caveat sign wrapped in red tape, trust becomes conditional and dubious. There are technical questions I cannot answer. I do not have the clearance or the desire to invent explanations that go beyond what we observed. Unknown beings contained in tanks, monitoring of vital signs, evidence that at least some of them exhibited behaviors we could only interpret as intelligence. Whether they were extraterrestrial in origin, a human-engineered species, a non-human terrestrial variant, or something else entirely, I do not know. That uncertainty is one of the few honest things I can offer. I can describe what I saw: cylindrical tanks, observation panes, monitors, biometrics that didn't behave like ours, the slow shock of recognition in a fossil-lid glass eye. I can also say what we did: attempted to transfer, failed, breached, lost control, and ultimately detonated.
That last act, the authorized demolition, still sits in my throat. I wrestle with the ethics of it. On one hand, the facility had become a hazard, and the risk of something being taken or studied by those who might not steward it responsibly was real. On the other hand, destroying what may have been intelligent life is a moral fracture that does not fit neatly into the categories of national security. We were given directives and acted within them, but orders cannot absolve conscience. There is a kind of moral bookkeeping you cannot escape. The ledger shows entries and no final reconciliations. Sometimes at night I wonder whether the crater tells the whole story. I wonder whether the demolition, even at its fiercest, would have guaranteed total annihilation. The facility built for containment was subterranean and complex. Blasts conceal, yes, but crevices and ducts do not always collapse as intended. There is the practical worry that some specimens could have been forced into voids the charges did not reach, that under tons of debris, beneath the new cap of red dirt, something might still breathe. It is not a comforting speculation. It is, however, a persistent one. In the distrust between secrecy and truth, there are also other victims, the public. They are denied the chance to weigh moral decisions with all the facts.
They are asked to accept a tidy statement and move on. Secrets like the one we carried force a paternalistic relationship. Men in uniform and those above them decide what knowledge is safe and what knowledge is not. I'm not naive. I know politics and tactics play into that calculus, but I prefer a flawed democracy that argues itself into truth than a quiet manumission of reality. Every now and then I get an anonymous letter or a grainy photograph slid under the door of a P.O. box. I used to open them with a soldier's steady hands and a reporter's curiosity. Some of those envelopes contained nothing but speculation. A few included pictures, blurred, probably staged, of what someone claimed to be pieces of glass or instruments, or even objects dug up in remote places. None of them proved anything. Some of them did the worst thing. They tethered hope to rumor and made reality seem both less accountable and more dangerous. I learned the hard way that secrecy isolates you from civilization's debates. It throws you into a soliloquy. If you speak, you break law. If you remain silent, you break yourself. Both are forms of violence you perpetrate on the soul. There is another practical dimension to this story, what I call the human ledger. Men who had been there suffered long-term effects beyond the immediate. Miguel's sleep was damaged. He chewed his nails until the skin broke, and he would stop mid-movement and look at his hand as if remembering a pump. Luna took to long hikes in the mountains with a pistol on his person and avoided personal conversation. Rodriguez stopped joking the way he had before. Hayes drank more coffee and fewer nights out. Moreno, who I will continue to call Moreno, though some memos spelled him as Moreno, fell into a quiet so deep he could dwell in a single room for an afternoon without making a sound. These were small human casualties of a larger edifice. I have been asked more than once whether I believe the specimens were alive in a way that demands rights. I do not have the right to say what the law would say or what God decrees. What I can tell you is this. Intelligence, however you define it, stares back. It recognizes itself in the curve of your eye and returns that recognition. You cannot look into such a gaze and remain unchanged. The experience forced on me and the others a set of moral questions that do not have military solutions. The last time I saw Dr. Moreno in person, it was at a small, mandatory R&D conference where he gave a talk about biocontainment protocols. He looked thinner than he had in the basement lights. He nodded at me like someone passing a fellow traveler in a shared dream. After the talk, paperwork waited, as always. He clasped my forearm in a way that felt like a benediction without words and said simply, "You did your duty." He did not look at me long after that. I wanted to ask him what he thought about what we had done, but the speechless thing we shared made questions a form of betrayal.
Years passed. The crater healed the way craters do. Dust drifts, the exchange of flora, the slow densification of Earth. The site was fenced and then guarded, and then by the time the public fuss had died down, written into internal records that only men with clearances could touch. Tourists never went there because there wasn't a monument to see, only a scar in the earth that could be read only from the right angle or by those willing to ask a question that officialdom preferred closed. I imagine some of you listening want to know whether I am accusing anyone of malice. I am not naive. Institutions make decisions on risk and benefit, and sometimes those calculations include terrible choices. I am accusing no one of the worst single thing, malice, only of something more ubiquitous, the habit of secrecy that believes it can do moral arithmetic in private. Humans have long tried to protect society by removing uncomfortable truths from public view. They will continue to do so.
The question is whether that habit should be allowed to expand without scrutiny. What keeps me awake isn't only the memory of the tanks or the pointing finger. It is the knowledge that the world is complicated and that sometimes moral clarity is strangled to serve an expedient outcome. I also wake thinking about other practicalities. What if something survived? What if under tons of rock a pulse persists? What would that mean for us, for the whole idea of sovereignty over life? These are not idle thoughts. They are the sorts of nightmares conscientious men carry. I have lived with the guilt of being silent and with the fear of speaking. I do not ask anyone to break laws. I will not counsel anyone to trespass on restricted land or to dig up sites that are watched by people with authority and weapons. I only ask those who hold power over secrecy to weigh with care the moral account they are keeping. Is it right to let an entire moral category, the right of an intelligence, be decided by a handful of men behind closed doors? How do we steward knowledge responsibly without hiding from the public the difficult choices we make? On the practical side, 5 of us, Hayes, Luna, Miguel, Rodriguez, and I, met more than once after the event under the odd nomenclature of post-incident wellness checks. We sat in one small room with coffee pressed, and for a few minutes we would tell sanitized versions of things we had seen: a breach, a transfer, the crater. But then we'd fall silent, each man keeping his ledger, making different calculations. Did we save countless lives by destroying what was bare? Did we commit a moral violence? There was no consensus. There was only shared trauma and the funny, painful intimacy of men who had seen the underside of a decision that sometimes defines the rest of your life. If there is anything I ask of the listener, it is this: treat such testimonies with the kind of skeptical openness that honors both memory and a need for proof.
I am not offering incontrovertible archives. I am offering the account of a man who stood in a control room and watched glass break and looked into eyes that were not the eyes of men. I am offering the moral questions that bled out from the event into years of my own life. I will not force you to believe me. My single hope is that you will consider how secrecy shapes the choices of those in power, and how witness, no matter how constrained, should have a place in the record of a nation. You might ask whether I have evidence. I have the impressions that memory keeps. I have scars that a lifetime in uniforms bestows, and I have a series of small facts that line up: the date, the trip from Kirtland, the elevator with 5 buttons, the schematic stamped with a red rectangle, the observation panes, tank 7, the fissure, the transfer, the breach, the evacuation, the demolition, the crater, the NDAs, the discharge. Those facts sit together in my history like beads on a string. They are testimony and nothing more. I believe secrecy are patient. They hide in documents, in redactions, in the little misprints where a name becomes Marino instead of Marino, in the bureaucracy that erases and reassigns and archives and then forgets. They are patient like a predator waiting for curiosity to name them, and reckless in their willingness to keep truth from the public. There is also a thin hope that keeps breathing in my life, the hope that the right conversations, open ones, could temper secrecy with accountability. If there is a lesson beyond the horror and the regret, it is that the balance between safety and truth cannot be continually weighted towards single-handed decisions made behind the gates. Civic life requires a bruise, but not amputation. I do not know whether anything remains under the desert. I do not have the arrogance to claim total knowledge. What I do know is that I saw with my eyes and that I carried the sight into the rest of my life. I have to live with that. Perhaps one day someone will do careful, lawful work and will uncover findings that either confirm or deny my memories. Perhaps a historian, an investigator, a brave reporter will gather testimony, build evidence, and present it to the public in a way that the world can weigh. If that day comes, I will not be surprised by curiosity. I will only be relieved that the ledger is out of my hands and into the world where debate can occur. So I speak now to anyone listening who feels the twitch of curiosity and the ethical knot of secrecy. Ask questions, but be lawful in your curiosity. Support institutions that demand transparency tempered by responsibility, and treat men who come forward, those who sign away silence and those who break it, with a mixture of skepticism and compassion. Witnessing is expensive. The price is often a lifetime. This is my testimony. I am Sergeant Ethan Ramirez. On September 17, 1987, U.S. soldiers found a sealed, non-human complex under New Mexico.
We tried to follow orders and uphold duties. We also made choices that will, for the rest of my days,
sit like weight in my chest. I can only hope that telling this now eases that weight, if only a little. If you want to hear other accounts from those who claim to have been at the edges of what we call secret history, there are more testimonies, some corroborated, some not. Watch them with appetite for evidence and respect for the human cost embedded in the stories. And if this account stirred something in you, questions, criticism, or a memory, please keep the conversation civil in the comments. There is a dignity to be preserved, even when discussing things that unsettle us. If you found this testimony valuable or thought-provoking, consider watching the next related account, where another eyewitness opens up about their experience with government sites and containment in the same era. Share respectfully, and if you can, support thoughtful inquiry into difficult subjects. Above all, remember, secrets do not stay buried forever. They are patient, and one day someone will dig.